Dela's world had shrunk to the size of a washtub. It smelled of lye soap, other people's sweat, and the faint coppery scent of blood from a skinned knuckle. Her hands were permanently puckered, the nails worn down to the quick. She worked from before the sun troubled the horizon until long after it had bled out behind the jagged peaks to the west, a lonely sentinel in the small shack that leaned against the edge of the town of Redemption. The town had not offered her any. It had only offered indifference, a force as steady and eroding as the prairie wind. Her husband, Tom, had been full of promises about the West, his eyes lit with the fever of a man who saw gold in every sunset. He had not found gold. He had found a rattlesnake in a patch of scrub, and Dela had found herself a widow with a 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and a future as thin and brittle as a shed snakeskin. The laundry she took in from the town's more prosperous folk was all that stood between them and absolute destitution. Each sheet she scrubbed, each shirt she ironed with the heavy flat iron heated on her small stove, was a defiance. It was a declaration that she and Lily would endure. Lily was the quiet center of her world, a small, dark-haired girl with Tom's serious eyes. She played with dolls made from corn husks and stones she arranged into careful families on the packed dirt floor. She rarely complained about the thin stew or the patched dress. Her silence was a weight on Dela's heart, a constant reminder of the bright, easy life she could not provide. Dela saved scraps of sugar for her, read to her from the one worn Bible they owned, and brushed her hair every night. The simple, repetitive motion, a prayer for a better life, she was no longer sure she believed in. The town of Redemption existed because of one man, Asa. He was not the mayor or the sheriff, but his power was more fundamental. His ranch, the Circle A, sprawled over more territory than a man could ride in 2 days, its cattle providing the beef that fed the town and the money that fueled its commerce. He was a pillar of the community, respected and feared, but he was also a ghost. Dela had seen him only a handful of times, a tall, broad-shouldered man on a formidable black horse, his face set in grim lines that discouraged approach. Town gossip, a currency more common than coin, said he had lost his wife in childbirth years ago and had never been the same. He was a man made of power and silence. News traveled fast in a place like Redemption, carried on the wind with the dust and grit. The news that day was about Asa's colt. It was not just any colt. It was the foal of his prized mare, a creature of legend, and sired by a stud that had cost Asa a fortune. This colt was the future of the Circle A line, a promise of speed and strength. And now, it couldn't stand. It favored its front leg, the limbs swollen and hot to the touch, the animal trembling with pain and fever. Dela heard the talk at the general store when she went to trade a stack of perfectly folded laundry for flour and beans. The men by the stove spoke in low, serious tones. Mr. Wallace, the store owner, leaned over the counter. "Dr. Evans has been out there since sunup," he said, polishing a glass jar. "Says he can't find a thing wrong with it. No break, no bite, just the swelling. Says it's a blight of the blood." Dr. Evans was the only medical authority for 100 miles, a man who treated both humans and livestock with the same pompous, overbearing confidence. He had a degree from back east and never let anyone forget it. A blight of the blood sounded exactly like something he would say, vague, ominous, and utterly useless. Dela listened, her hands clutching her string bag. Swelling, fever, a leg that wouldn't bear weight, but no visible wound. The description snagged on a memory, sharp and clear. Her father had not been a learned man, but he knew the land. He had been a trapper and a farmer, a man who read seasons and animal tracks like other men read books. He had taught her about the things a fancy doctor might miss. He'd taught her about devilwood, a type of scrub brush with thorns that were thin as a needle and black as sin. They could drive deep into flesh, breaking off beneath the skin, the entry point closing up almost instantly. The wood itself carried a poison that would fester, causing a deep burning infection that could cripple a man or kill a horse. He had shown her how to spot the nearly invisible puncture, how to smell the specific, sour scent of the infection it caused. She paid for her flour, her mind racing. It was not her place. She was a laundress, a widow, a woman who was supposed to be invisible. To approach a man like Asa, to question the diagnosis of a man like Dr. Evans, was unthinkable. It was a sure way to invite scorn, even trouble. She walked back toward her shack, the wind pulling at her skirts, trying to push the thought from her mind. But the image of the animal, suffering and helpless, would not leave her. Her father had always said it was a sin to stand by and watch a creature in pain when you had the means to help. Lily was waiting for her on the stoop, her small face anxious. "Mama, is it supper time?" Dela looked at her daughter, at the patched knees of her dress, and then at the vast, indifferent expanse of the prairie stretching toward the Circle A. To do nothing was safe. It was what everyone expected. But her father's voice was a low murmur in her ear. "What good is knowing if you don't act on it?" She made a decision. It felt less like a choice, and more like a current she had to follow. She made a quick meal for Lily, then packed a small cloth bag with a needle from her sewing kit, a small jar of the strong soap she used for stains, and a clean rag. She held Lily's hand. "We're going for a walk, sweet girl." The walk was long, miles of dusty track that led out of the town's meager orbit and into the vastness of Asa's domain. The Circle A was not just a ranch. It was a kingdom. The main house was a formidable two-story structure made of stone and timber, built to withstand anything the frontier could throw at it. Barns and outbuildings spread out from it like a fleet of smaller ships around a galleon. Dela's courage faltered. She, in her faded calico dress, holding the hand of her small, dusty child, felt like a field mouse approaching a mountain lion's den. Ranch hands stopped their work to stare as she approached the stables. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A woman like her had no business here. Before she could lose her nerve, she saw him. Asa stood in the wide-open doorway of the main barn, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. Even from a distance, she could feel the cold anger radiating from him. She took a deep breath that tasted of dust and horses. "Mister," she called out, her voice smaller than she intended. He did not move. She tried again, louder. "Mr. Asa?" He turned slowly. His face was hard, carved from granite and shadowed by the brim of his hat. His eyes, a startling pale gray, were cold and impatient. He looked at her, at Lily, and his gaze was a dismissal. "We're not hiring," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and we're not giving handouts." "I'm not here for that," Dela said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I heard about your Colt." His jaw tightened. A flicker of raw pain crossed his face before it was replaced by a mask of stone. "The vet's been and gone. There's nothing to be done." His tone was final. It was an order to leave. This was the moment. She could turn and walk away, back to the safety of her obscurity. But then Lily, who rarely spoke to strangers, stepped forward. "Is the pony sick?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Mama can help. She helps everything." Asa's gaze dropped to the child. The hardness in his eyes did not soften, but it wavered, just for a second. He was a man who had lost a child. The sight of one, small and innocent, seemed to momentarily breach his defenses. Dela seized the opening. "Dr. Evans is a good doctor," she said carefully, knowing she was walking on thin ice. "But there are things the land knows that books don't always teach. If there's no visible wound, it might be a deep splinter. From devilwood. I've seen it before. It festers from the inside." Asa stared at her. his expression unreadable. He was a man accustomed to giving orders, not listening to theories from a penniless widow. He looked from her earnest face to the barn where the colt suffered, then back again. Desperation was a powerful solvent, capable of dissolving pride and certainty. "What would you do?" he asked, the question sharp as a shard of glass. "I'd need to look, to touch the leg," she said simply, "and I'd need hot water and a clean rag." He considered her for a long, silent moment. The ranch hands watched, waiting for their boss to send her packing. Instead, he gave a curt nod. "Fine," he said, as if the word were torn from him. "Look. But if you trouble that animal for nothing, you'll answer to me." He turned and strode into the barn, not waiting to see if she would follow. Dela squeezed Lily's hand, whispered for her to wait by the door with one of the older, kinder-looking hands, and walked out of the bright sun and into the cool, tense twilight of the stable. The barn smelled of hay, horse, and the sour tang of sickness. In a large stall, bedded with clean straw, the colt lay on its side. It was a beautiful creature, all long legs and bewildered eyes, its coat the color of dark honey. Its breath came in ragged shudders. The left foreleg was horribly swollen from the knee to the fetlock, the skin stretched tight and glossy. Asa stood on the far side of the stall, his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration and grief. He looked like a king watching a part of his kingdom die. Dela ignored him. She knelt in the straw, her movements slow and deliberate. "Easy now," she murmured, not to the man, but to the horse. "Easy, little one." The colt's ears twitched. Its eyes, wide with pain, rolled toward her. She didn't reach for it immediately. She just knelt there, letting it grow accustomed to her scent, her presence. She spoke to it in a low, crooning monotone, the same voice she used to soothe Lily's nightmares. After a long minute, the animal's trembling seemed to lessen. She held her hand out, palm up, letting it sniff her fingers. Then, slowly, she stroked its neck, her touch firm but gentle. She moved down its shoulder, murmuring reassurances. When she reached the swollen leg, the colt flinched and tried to pull away. "Shh, I know it hurts. I'm just looking." She didn't just look with her eyes. She laid her palm flat against the swollen flesh, feeling the radiating heat. She closed her eyes, concentrating on the feedback from her fingertips, searching for a focal point, a spot hotter than the rest. Asa watched her, his skepticism a palpable force in the quiet barn. He saw a laundress kneeling in the dirt, her eyes closed, her hand on a dying horse. It looked like a prayer, or a fool's errand. Her fingers found it. A small, almost imperceptible knot deep beneath the skin, an epicenter of heat and hardness no bigger than a pea. She ran her fingers over the area, her touch as light as a feather, searching the skin. There. A tiny, discolored speck, no larger than a poppy seed. It was not a cut or a scrape. It was a puncture, already healing over, almost invisible to the naked eye. She leaned closer, inhaling deeply. And there it was, faint but unmistakable, the sour, acrid smell of a festering devilwood thorn. "It's here," she said, her voice quiet but certain. She looked up at Asa. "The splinter. It's driven deep." A ranch hand appeared at the stall door with a bucket of steaming water and a rag, as she'd requested. She dipped the rag, wrung it out, and began to gently clean the area. "I'll need to open it," she said, not looking at him. "I have a needle." She pulled the small cloth-wrapped sewing needle from her pocket. Asa's face darkened. "You'll lame him for good with a sewing needle." "Leaving it in will kill him," she countered, her voice steady. She didn't wait for his permission. She held the needle in the steam from the water bucket for a long moment, then wiped it with the lye soap and rinsed it again. She turned back to the colt. "Hold his head," she told Asa. Talk to him. For a second, he looked as if he might refuse the order. Then he knelt on the other side of the colt, his large calloused hand stroking the animal's muzzle, his voice a low rumble. Dela took a deep breath. Her hand was rock steady. With a quick, precise movement, she pierced the tiny speck on the colt's leg. The horse jerked, but Asa's firm hand and soothing voice kept it from panicking. A single drop of dark, foul-smelling pus welled up. She pressed gently around the opening with her thumbs. Nothing. The splinter was too deep. This was the part her father had warned her about. You couldn't always just pull them. Sometimes you had to draw them. She stood up and went to the door where she'd left her small bag. She'd gathered the ingredients on her walkover, her hands moving with an old, ingrained knowledge. She took out a handful of broad-leafed plantain, the weed that grew along every dusty track, and a few leaves of yarrow. Using 2 clean stones, she mashed them together into a rough, green pulp. She carried the poultice back to the stall and packed the moist paste into the small opening she had made. "What is that?" Asa asked, his voice rough with suspicion. "Witchcraft?" "It's plantain and yarrow," she said, not rising to his tone. "The plantain draws out poisons and thorns. The yarrow fights the corruption." She covered the poultice with the last clean piece of her rag and stood up, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Now we wait." Waiting was the hardest part. They stood in the silent barn, a powerful rancher and a poor widow, their attention fixed on the small bandaged spot on a colt's leg. Minutes stretched into an hour. The colt's breathing evened out. The frantic, pained energy seemed to be leaving its body. After what felt like a lifetime, Dela knelt again and gently removed the rag. The poultice was dark, almost black. And sticking out from the center of it, drawn from the depths of the wound, was the tip of the splinter. It was long and thin and black. Using her fingernails as pincers, Dela gripped the end and pulled. It came free with a soft, sucking sound. She held it up in the dim light. It was over an inch long, a wicked-looking sliver of dark wood. She dropped it into Asa's outstretched palm. He stared at it, then at her, his gray eyes wide with a stunned, dawning comprehension. At that moment, the colt sighed, a deep, shuddering exhalation, and for the first time in 2 days, it shifted its weight, testing the injured leg. It held. Asa never said thank you. Words were not his currency. Instead, 2 days later, he appeared at her shack. He did not knock. He simply stood there, his presence seeming to shrink the small yard. "The colt is standing," he said. It was not a question. "It will be," Dela replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "The fever is gone. The swelling will take time." He looked at the washtub, at the lines of drying laundry that represented her entire livelihood. He looked at Lily, who peeked at him from behind her mother's skirts. "I have chickens," he said abruptly, "and a garden that's gone to weed. The woman who tended them left. The work is there." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an offer laid on the ground for her to either pick up or walk around. It meant a small cabin on his land, a steady supply of food from the ranch kitchen, and a wage, however small. It meant leaving the washtub behind. It meant security. It also meant living under the shadow of this powerful, unreadable man, on his land, by his rules. "We'd be obliged," Dela said, her voice quiet. It was the only answer she could give. Life on the Circle A was a different kind of solitude. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a real glass window and a tight roof. It was near the main house but separate, a clear demarcation of her status. She was an employee, nothing more. She tended the chickens, collected the eggs, and began the arduous task of reclaiming the kitchen garden from a riot of weeds and neglect. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was work that created, that nurtured. Her hands, though still rough, now smelled of earth and time instead of lye. Asa kept his distance. She would see him riding out at dawn with his men, or returning at dusk, covered in dust, his face set in its usual grim lines. He never spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her sometimes as she worked in the garden or scattered feed for the hens. His observation was not unkind, merely watchful, as if she were a new and unpredictable element in his tightly controlled world. The colt became the unspoken link between them. It was moved to a small pasture near the garden, and Dela often found herself leaning on the fence, watching it. Its leg was healing perfectly, the swelling gone, leaving only a faint scar she knew would eventually vanish beneath its coat. One afternoon, Asa came and stood beside her at the fence. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the colt kick up its heels and race its own shadow across the grass. "He'll be a fine horse," Asa said, his voice low. It was as close to an admission of gratitude as he was capable of, and it settled in Dela's heart with a surprising warmth. Lily, who had been so quiet and withdrawn in the town, began to blossom on the ranch. The open space, the animals, the absence of want. It was all a tonic to her small spirit. She would follow Dela in the garden, chattering away, her hands full of wildflowers. One evening, Dela came back to the cabin to find a book lying on the porch step. It was not new, but it was in good condition, a collection of illustrated fables. There was no note, no indication of who had left it. But Dela knew. There was only one person on the ranch who would have done it, who had seen Lily trying to sound out words from the worn family Bible. She ran her hand over the smooth cover, a lump forming in her throat. A gift of words was more precious than gold. The foreman, a man named Jed, made his resentment of her plain. He was a hard man who had been with Asa for years, and he saw Dela's presence as an intrusion. He did not like the way the boss looked at the widow, nor the way she had succeeded where a proper doctor had failed. He made her life difficult in small ways, leaving a gate open so the chickens would scatter, or, forgetting, to leave her a share of the meat from a slaughtered steer. Dela bore his hostility with quiet stoicism, refusing to complain, knowing it would only make things worse. One afternoon, she was in the small barn mending a leather bridle, a skill her father had also taught her. The light was fading, and she was concentrating on her stitches when Asa entered. He didn't seem to notice her at first. He picked up a pair of his own riding gloves from a bench. They were worn, the leather stiff and cracked. A seam split across the knuckles. He looked at them with disgust and was about to toss them aside. "I can mend those," Dela heard herself say. He turned, surprised, as if he'd forgotten she was there. He looked at the neat work she was doing on the bridle, then back at his gloves. Without a word, he set them down on the bench beside her and left. The next morning, she left the repaired gloves on the same bench. The leather was cleaned and softened with tallow, the split seam stitched so neatly it was almost invisible. Later that day, she saw him wearing them. He never mentioned it, but the small, unspoken exchange felt more intimate than a whole conversation. It was a language of action and need, a language they were both beginning to understand. The slow burn of their connection was ignited by a summer storm. It rolled in from the plains without warning, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. Wind lashed the ranch, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. A loud crack of splitting timber sent Dela running from her cabin. A huge gust of wind had torn a section of fence away from the chicken coop, and the terrified birds were scattering into the maelstrom. She ran toward the chaos, her skirt instantly soaked and heavy, the wind tearing her hair from its pins. Suddenly, Asa was there beside her, his face grim, shouting orders that were snatched away by the wind. They worked together, herding the frantic chickens back toward the coop. A large section of the broken fence, caught by a sudden gust, swung violently toward her. She didn't see it coming, but Asa did. His arm shot out, his hand clamping around her upper arm, and he yanked her back against him. The heavy plank swung past, inches from her face. For a moment, they stood frozen. She was pressed against the solid wall of his chest, his hand still gripping her arm. She could feel the heat of him through their soaked clothes, smell the scent of rain and wet earth, and something that was uniquely him. The world seemed to fall away, the roar of the storm fading to a dull hum. He looked down at her, his gray eyes no longer cold, but dark with an emotion she couldn't name. Neither of them breathed. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then he released her, his hand dropping away as if burned. "Get inside," he yelled over the wind. He grabbed a hammer and nails and began forcing the broken fence back into place, his movements furious and efficient. Dela retreated to the shelter of the barn, her arm tingling where he had touched her, her heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with the storm. Dr. Evans had not forgotten his humiliation. His pride, a brittle and oversized thing, had been shattered. In the general store, in the saloon, in the churchyard after Sunday service, he planted his seeds of poison. He didn't have to say much. He just had to raise an eyebrow, to murmur about folk remedies and ignorant women. He spoke of the dangers of unsanctioned medicine, hinting at darker arts. "Coincidence," he'd say with a dismissive wave of his hand when someone mentioned the Colt. "The fever broke on its own. It's a miracle my own poultices weren't counteracted by whatever concoction she brewed up." The town, which had first been impressed, now grew suspicious. Dela was an outsider. Her quietness was mistaken for secrecy. Her knowledge of herbs, once a curiosity, now seemed sinister. Women who had once given her a polite nod now crossed the street to avoid her. The whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. Witch. Charlatan. Jed the foreman fanned the flames on the ranch, telling the other hands that the widow had put a spell on the boss, that it wasn't natural. Dela felt the chill. The isolation on the ranch, which had once felt like peace, now felt like exile. She kept to her cabin and her garden, her world shrinking once more. Her only solace was Lily and the steady, silent regard of Asa. He seemed oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His presence was a silent shield, and as long as she was on his land, she knew she was safe from anything more than whispers. Then the threat ceased to be a whisper. It took the form of a cough. Lily's cough started small, a dry little hack in the night. Dela gave her thyme tea and rubbed her chest with a salve of mutton tallow and pine resin, but the cough didn't go away. It deepened, settling in her small chest with a wet, rattling sound. A fever followed, hot and stubborn. Lily grew listless, her bright eyes clouded with sickness, her breath coming in shallow rasps. It was lung fever. Dela knew the signs, and a cold dread washed over her. Her own herbs could soothe, they could support. But this was a fierce infection, and it was winning. She needed a doctor. She swallowed her pride and sent one of the ranch hands, a younger man named Billy who was still kind to her, into town to fetch Dr. Evans. An hour later, Billy returned alone, his face pale. "He won't come, Mrs. Dela," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. He said he don't treat families who practice witchcraft. He said whatever she's got, you brought it on her yourself. The words struck Dela like a physical blow. The doctor had not just refused to help, he had condemned her. He had used her child's life as a weapon in his war of pride. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She was alone. The community she had tried so hard to exist alongside had not just rejected her, it had sentenced her daughter. At that moment, Asa was gone, having ridden out 2 days prior with a large herd of cattle bound for the railhead, a trip that would take the better part of a week. For 3 days and 3 nights, Dela fought for Lily's life. She sat by the small bed, bathing her daughter's feverish skin, forcing sips of willow bark tea and thin broth between her pale lips. She prayed until her throat was raw, her pleas mingling with the sound of Lily's labored breathing. The little cabin became a sealed world of fear and desperate hope. She grew thin and hollow-eyed, moving like a ghost through the long hours. She felt the town's judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her small roof. They were out there, watching, waiting for her to fail. She began to believe them. Had she brought this on them? Had her pride, her insistence on helping the Colt, brought this curse down upon her own child? The thought was a torment. She decided, in the dim, desperate hours before one dawn, that she had to leave. If she and Lily were the source of the trouble, they would remove it. As soon as Lily was strong enough to travel, they would go. They would disappear into the vastness of the West, and the Circle A and the town of redemption could return to their orderly existence. Asa returned at dusk on the 5th day. He rode into the ranch yard, weary and trail-dusted, and knew at once that something was wrong. The usual evening calm was absent. There was a tense, waiting stillness. He saw Billy's anxious face and strode toward Dela's cabin, his gut twisting with a nameless dread. He found her packing. A small, pathetic bundle of their belongings sat on the table. Dela herself looked like a wraith, her face pale and etched with exhaustion, her eyes wide with a despair that mirrored the one he kept locked deep inside himself. Lily lay in the bed, terrifyingly still, her breath a faint whisper. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough. "She's sick," Dela whispered, her voice cracking. "The doctor won't come. The town, they blame me. I can't let them hurt her. We're leaving. As soon as she can travel, we're leaving." She was trying to protect her child by running. He understood that. But all he saw was another loss. He saw a woman and child, who had brought a flicker of warmth into his frozen world, about to vanish. The old, familiar armor of grief and distance snapped shut around his heart. The memory of his wife, of his own child lost to a fever just like this, was a blinding pain. He couldn't face it again. He became the man he had been before she arrived, cold, silent, and closed. He gave a single, curt nod, turned without a word, and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her hope. The door closing behind him was the sound of the world ending. Dela's last ember of hope died in the silence Asa left behind. His nod was not just an agreement, it was an abandonment. He had seen her desperation and turned away. The small, fragile connection they had built had shattered. She was truly, utterly alone. She sank into the chair by Lily's bed, the fight draining out of her. The decision to leave was no longer a choice, it was a grim necessity. Through the long night, Lily's breathing grew fainter, shallower. It was a terrifying, almost inaudible rattle. The fever had stolen her strength, and she was slipping away. Dela felt a surge of desperate, primal energy. There was one last thing, one last remedy her father had told her about. A thing of last resort. Moonroot, a gnarled, pale root that grew only in the crevices of the high, rocky bluffs to the north, a place of loose scree and dangerous drops. It was a powerful febrifuge, known to break the most stubborn of lung fevers, but it was a risk to find, especially in the dark. She looked at her sleeping child, her face a pale shadow on the pillow. There was no choice. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. On a scrap of paper from the back of the fable book, she wrote a hasty note. "Went for moonroot on the North Bluff for Lily. If I am not back by dawn..." She couldn't finish the thought. She simply wrote, "Take care of her." She left the note on the table where he would see it, a final desperate plea to the man who had already walked away. Then she slipped out of the cabin and into the cold, starless night. Asa had not slept. He sat in the dark of his own house, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, the ghosts of his past swirling around him. He had let her down. He had seen her pain and retreated into his own, a coward's refuge. The memory of her face, so full of despair, was a brand on his conscience. He was letting history repeat itself, standing by, helpless, as a fever stole a life from his world. The thought was unbearable. Finally, unable to stand the silence and his own self-loathing, he rose and walked back toward her cabin, drawn by an invisible thread of concern he could no longer deny. He saw the faint light of the lamp and pushed the door open quietly. The cabin was empty, save for the small form in the bed. Panic seized him. Had she left already? Carried her sick child into the night? Then he saw the note on the table. He read the hurried scrawl, and the words "North Bluff" sent a jolt of ice through his veins. The bluffs were treacherous in daylight, a place of shifting rock and hidden drops. At night, it was suicide. And she had gone there, alone, for her child. In that moment, the wall around his heart did not just crack, it crumbled into dust. Her courage, her fierce, desperate love, was a force of nature that shamed his own fear-driven retreat. He would not lose her. He would not stand by this time. He ran to the stable, saddled his fastest horse, and galloped out of the ranch yard, a man not just chasing a woman, but chasing his own redemption. He found her an hour later, a small, determined figure high on the bluff, clinging to the rock face. Her skirt was torn, her hands were bleeding, but in one of them she clutched a pale, gnarled root. As he watched, her foot slipped on a patch of loose shale. She cried out, dangling precariously over a dark drop. Asa spurred his horse up the treacherous path, dismounting and scrambling the last few feet on foot. He reached her just as her grip was failing, his strong hands closing around her waist, pulling her back from the edge and onto the safety of the ledge. She collapsed against him, shaking and sobbing, not from fear, but from relief and exhaustion. She held up the root. "I got it," she gasped. "I got it." He didn't scold her. He didn't say a word. He simply wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his face buried in her tangled hair. He had come so close to losing her. He lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her, and held her securely against his chest as they made their way carefully back down the bluff. It was a rescue, but he was the one who felt saved. He had ridden into the dark to save her, and in doing so, had saved himself from the cold, empty prison of his grief. They raced back to the cabin, while Dela, her hands now steady, prepared the root, shaving it into a cup of hot water. Asa built up the fire and gently bathed Lily's face with a cool cloth. They worked together in a seamless, unspoken partnership. Dela administered the medicine, a few drops at a time, into her daughter's mouth. Then, they sat together and waited for the dawn, the space between them no longer an empty chasm, but a bridge of shared hope. As the first pale light of morning streaked the sky, Lily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. The feverish glaze was gone. She looked at her mother and whispered, "Mama, I'm hungry." The simple words were the most beautiful sound Dela had ever heard. Tears of relief streamed down her face. Asa reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his. A sharp knock on the door broke the sacred quiet. Asa opened it to find Dr. Evans standing on the step, flanked by the town sheriff. Evans's face was a mask of smug righteousness. "Sheriff," he said loudly, for the benefit of the ranch hands who had begun to gather. "I am here to report this woman for endangering a child and practicing medicine without authority. For the safety of this community, she needs to be removed." Asa stepped out onto the porch, blocking the doorway. He was no longer the grim, silent rancher. He stood tall, his face calm but radiating an authority more powerful than any badge. "There will be no removing anyone, Doctor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the yard like a rifle shot. He looked at Evans, his pale eyes glinting like steel. "This woman saved my Colt when you left it to die. She just saved her daughter's life with her knowledge and her courage, after you refused to even see the child." He took a step closer to the sputtering doctor. "Your knowledge comes from a book and a piece of paper. Hers comes from the earth, and from a heart that is not poisoned by pride." He turned to the sheriff. "Dela and her daughter are part of this ranch now. She is under my protection. She has a home here." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces of his men and finally resting on Evans. "If you, or anyone else, has a problem with that, you have a problem with me." The challenge was absolute. Dr. Evans paled, his bluster evaporating under Asa's cold fury. The sheriff, a practical man who knew where the real power in the county lay, simply nodded. "If there's no complaint from you, Mr. Asa, there's no crime here." He tipped his hat and turned, leaving Dr. Evans standing alone, exposed and diminished in the morning light. The foreman, Jed, who had been watching from the crowd, stared at the ground, then turned and walked away. The battle was over. Dela had not just been defended, she had been claimed. She stood in the doorway, Lily wrapped in a blanket in her arms, and watched as Asa stood against the world for her. He had saved her from exile, and she, with her quiet strength and healing hands, had saved him from himself. A month later, the last of the summer heat had given way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The ranch was alive with the rhythms of the season. Lily, fully recovered and brimming with a healthy, childish energy, chased the young colt in the pasture near the house. The horse, now strong and sleek, would let her get close, nudging her gently with its muzzle, a bond formed in sickness and healing. Dela had a new garden. Asa had tasked 2 of his men with plowing a large plot for her near the main house, and she was carefully transplanting her herbs, giving them room to grow. Inside the main house kitchen, a set of new pine shelves lined one wall, empty and waiting. Asa had built them himself. He had said nothing, just built them, the scent of fresh-cut wood a silent invitation. They were for her jars, for her remedies, for her to bring her life into his. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Dela stood by her new garden, breathing in the scent of damp earth. Asa came out of the house and walked over to her. He didn't carry the weight of his grief anymore. It was still a part of him, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined him. He handed her a steaming mug of coffee. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Lily play, watching the day end. The vast, wild frontier that had once seemed so threatening now felt like a cradle, a place of possibility. He had found his voice to protect her, and she had found her courage to save them both. He reached out and took her free hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet, irreversible choice. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of silent companionship, of a home built not just of timber and stone, but of mutual need and quiet, unshakable love. The world was still wild, but here, in the circle of his protection and the warmth of his hand, Dela was finally home. We all face moments where we feel lost or discarded, waiting for someone to see the strength we have inside. Dela's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from a doctor's decree, but from a quiet act of courage. We hope her journey from the washtub to the heart of the ranch brought you a sense of peace and vindication. If you felt the warmth of that prairie sunset, please give this story a like, subscribe for more tales of love on the frontier, and ring that bell so you never miss a new chapter. We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to trust your own knowledge when an expert told you something different? Thank you for listening, and may you find your own safe harbor.